Okay. Welcome, everyone. It's so wonderful to see those of you that are here on this cold, chilly night in the Elvehjem building. And I also want to welcome those of you who are joining us online. We're streaming live, and just for those of you here, I also want to mention that the recording of tonight's lecture will also be preserved in our YouTube archive that the department has online. So please check it out for this lecture and many more. I'm Anna Andrzejewski. I'm a professor here in the department and Centennial Chair, which means basically I direct a wonderful group of faculty and graduate students who are organizing events in honor of the department's 100th anniversary. We've been around for 100 years, which is pretty incredible, or I should say we will be around for 100 years as of 2025, but that's just around the corner, so I think I can get away with it. And this event is part of that. Tonight's event, as I'm sure Professor Cassad will also mention, is funded by the University Lectures Committee, funding from the LNS Dean's Office, as well as a grant from the Anonymous Fund. And they are supporting our centennial activities, and we are forever grateful. I would encourage you also to check out upcoming events associated with the centennial on our webpage, arthistory.wisc.edu. February 6th and 7th coming up. We will have a panel discussion and lecture around the theme of transforming curatorial practice in the 21st century. Then in April, April 3rd and 4th, we will have a symposium or panel discussion and lecture associated with the theme of campus art museums as learning labs, paying homage to the tradition, the partnership that we've long had with the Chazen Museum of Art. And then, not to be forgotten, is the official marking of our centennial, September 25th, 26th, 2025. We will have a symposium and a big party, and everyone is invited, so I encourage you to join us. I'd now like to turn the podium over to my colleague, Professor Jill Cassad, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
So welcome on behalf of the UW-Madison Department of Art History, our co-sponsors, the Department of African Cultural Studies and the UW-Madison Center for Visual Cultures, and the UW-Madison Lectures Fund, whom we thank for assisting us in supporting this evening's event. It's really my deep pleasure and genuine honor to welcome you on this distinctly Madison evening to our distinguished alum lecture by Dr. Matthew Francis Rarey, who's currently Associate Professor of African and Black Atlantic Art History and Chair of Art History at Oberlin. A prize-winning scholar and award-winning curator of African and African diasporic arts, Dr. Rarey received his PhD in art history at the UW-Madison in 2014. His visit back to campus, which includes tonight's lecture and a professional workshop for graduate students earlier today, these are a key part of the lead up to the Department of Art History's celebration of its centennial in 2025. Founded by German scholar Oskar Hagen in 1925, the Department of Art History is among the oldest in the country. Across its 100-year history, it's grown from a few instructors teaching courses in American and Western European art and architecture to one in which more than a dozen teach courses on arts in a variety of media across the globe. The UW-Madison has a particularly notable history of contributions to the field in the study of African and African diasporic arts and their histories. And in the wake of Dr. Henry Druhl's retirement, the department made a significant hire last year in partnership with African Cultural Studies and are pleased to welcome Dr. Elaine Sullivan. So I'm Dr. Jill Cassad. I'm a professor of visual studies in the departments of art history and gender and women's studies here at the UW-Madison, an institution which occupies the unceded territory of the Ho-Chunk Nation. Our event this evening is a hybrid one, and my warm welcome goes out to those of you who are joining us on YouTube Live, and those of us, thank you for braving the cold to join us in person. I want to thank friend and colleague Chi-Ming Yang for the acknowledgement that Zoom and YouTube are not outside settler colonial occupation. We remember that virtual space, too, has a material basis and participates in the ongoing legacies of land theft. And it's my responsibility and my personal acknowledgement that without material consideration of land back, reparations, and abolition, such acknowledgement is never enough. I serve currently as Director of Graduate Studies for our graduate program in art history, where it's my privilege to work with an extraordinary team. Our brilliant department administrator, Peggy Hacker, our graduate program coordinator, Teddy Call, and our administrative assistant and event planner extraordinaire, Jane McCarthy, without whose tireless efforts this evening wouldn't be possible. So in addition to thanking our Centennial Chair, Anna Andrzejewski, let's give them all a round of thanks, please. The department's distinguished alumni events are a key part of the graduate program in Art History's Professional Development Initiative that was initially made possible in part by special support from the UW-Madison Graduate School. Our aim with this initiative, now in its third year, is to bring prominent alumni of our program to campus. Each alum lecture visit also features a professional workshop. The Distinguished Alumni Lecture Series has 4 main goals: demonstrating the relationship between the cultivation of disciplinary expertise in art history in our graduate program and training for professional careers, providing a framework for near-peer mentoring, offering mentoring and networking opportunities, and breaking down the steps behind the arc of a major career. We hope you'll join us February 6-7 when we welcome alumni Dr. Lindy Lettinen, Philip D. Nathanson, Senior Curator of Photography at the Huntington Library, Dr. Marcela Guerrero, DiMartini Family Curator at the Whitney Museum of Art, and Drew Sawyer, Sandra Gilman, Curator of Photography, also at the Whitney, who will be joining us for a symposium conversation on the evening of February 7th. This evening, I'm thrilled to introduce our featured guest, Dr. Matt Rarey. This evening's distinguished alum lecture in the lead up to our department centennial builds out from the original research at the center of Rarey's prize-winning book, Insignificant Things, Amulets and the Art of Survival in the Early Black Atlantic, published by Duke in 2023. That, I want to emphasize, won the College Art Association's Charles Rufus Maury Award, the highest honor for an early career scholar in the field of art history. Dr. Rarey's research interests and publications span assemblage and ephemeral aesthetics, cross-cultural conceptions and visualizations of enslavement, and the arts of Afro-Atlantic religions as they transform between Africa and South America in the long 18th century. Among other venues, his writings have appeared in African Arts and the Art Bulletin, as well as in volumes such as African Heritage and Memories of Slavery in Brazil and the South Atlantic World, and most recently, Black Modernisms in the Transatlantic World, published by Yale Press in 2023, in which I urge you to read if you've not yet had the chance. Rarey's work also extends to the curatorial field. In 2019, alongside Andrea Girodi, he co-curated Afterlives of the Black Atlantic at the Alum Memorial Art Museum at Oberlin College, which received a 2020 Award of Excellence from the Association of Art Museum Curators. Dr. Rarey is currently at work on a Portuguese translation of Insignificant Things, as well as a book about 18th century maps of maroon communities in South America and the afterlives of these maps in the work of contemporary Black artists and land rights activists. Dr. Rarey's work challenges our field's very foundations by excavating Europeans' and Africans' disagreements over the value of objects and lives in 16th and 17th century West Africa, while showing how the discourse of fetishism has played a critical role in delimiting the material and conceptual contours of what is called African art history. But what's most significant about Rarey's work is that it doesn't stop there. Dr. Rarey persistently shows us ways of approaching the strange eloquence of objects in contesting legal and religious prohibitions in their day and their potential agency in speaking back to the racializing mechanisms still at work in art history now. To give you a sense of the effect of his work, I'd like to share this from Stephen Nelson, author of From Cameroon to Paris and Dean of the Center for Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts. And Dr. Nelson writes about Dr. Rarey's book. In this groundbreaking, beautifully written, and deeply researched book, Matthew Francis Rarey reframes our understanding of the Black Atlantic and the complex social and cultural terrain of the Lusophone world. He not only sheds light on bodies and their vulnerabilities, but also opens onto worlds of sorcery, jurisprudence, and human relations. Most importantly, he shows how enslaved people took advantage of any power they could find or construct. Insignificant Things is a stunning contribution to the larger study of Blackness and formations of modernism, and a model for those who seek to do this kind of transcultural and diasporic work. Of course, there's more and much more to say, and not least, what a gift it's been to think with Dr. Rarey over the years. So thank you, Matt, for your presence with us this evening.
Oh, I was going to ask you for a poster. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Hi. There we go. Yes. I gave my very first art history lecture in this room 17 years ago, I think. I was a teaching assistant in Nicholas Cahill's Ancient to Medieval Art course, and I was a teaching assistant. I gave a lecture on the pyramids. And suffice it to say, I would not be back here in front of all of you. So I thank everyone who thinks I'm distinguished. I have many, many people to thank. The Department of Art History, the Department of African Cultural Studies, the Center for Visual Cultures, the University Lectures Committee. But I especially want to thank a few people, the first of whom is Henry Druel, who taught me what it meant to love and to practice art history. And the second one is Jill Cassad, who I just had the honor of having her introduce me, who profoundly shaped and continues to shape my life as a human being and my life as a scholar. So I have 19 pages in front of me, clocks in at about 48 minutes. It's divided sort of into two sections, even though they're not labeled inside of the talk. The first section, I'm going to do some framing, some background information, and sort of delve into some of the main arguments in Insignificant Things. And in the second 2/3 of the talk, I'm actually going to disagree with some things that I wrote in the book. Or rather than a disagreement, a kind of reframing or revisiting of some of the material to pose different questions that I felt I didn't have the conceptual space to address in the text. So I'm really looking forward to your questions. My argument tonight is simple and provocative, that the document on the screen is one of the founding treatises of the discipline of African art history. You are looking at the cover page of Lisbon Inquisition Trial 11767, a bound collection of 130 handwritten folios written between 1730 and 1731, which transcribe the criminal proceedings against a man named José Francisco Pereira. Pereira, as the cover outlined, was born, raised, and enslaved in West Africa, but was residing in Lisbon, Portugal, when he was arrested in July of 1730, alongside his friend and business partner, José Francisco Pedroso, another enslaved West African man living in Lisbon. Already, the implicit contours of my argument should be coming into focus, that one genealogy of the discipline of African art history begins with the disciplining of Africans' lives in a colonial metropolis. Moreover, José Francisco Pereira and Pedroso's trials display their accusers' early efforts to simultaneously create and invoke the categories of blackness, Africanity, and African material culture. Analytic framings whose institutionalization and criminalization would, in the ensuing centuries, undergird the formation of African art history as a discipline. This comes into focus at José Francisco Pedroso's sentencing in June of 1731, when he was convicted of committing feitiçaria. In its most convenient translation into English, this word, feitiçaria, means to work with fetishes, or in Portuguese, feitiços. At the time of José Francisco's trial, feitiço referenced an indeterminate class of material objects that controlled, manipulated, or counteracted a range of invisible and malevolent forces, but it was increasingly associated with African spiritual labors at this time. José Francisco's trial, as we will see, is an early iteration of the later critical role of the concept of the fetish and the role that it will play in mediating the web of ideas that birth the concepts of Africa and Europe. I will use this postcard, actually produced in Angola at the turn of the 20th century, to ground the point. Below the image, a bold red typeface stands out against the sepia background, visually equating the word Congo, a Central African kingdom, cultural area, and European colony, with feitiço. Conceptually and geographically, Africa here is inseparable from the fetish. That relationship began even prior to José Francisco's trial, when feitiço and its many derivations in European languages were deployed to mark the cross-cultural disagreements between European traders, middlemen, and African merchants over the values of objects, bodies, and lives during the rapid expansion of human trafficking and material trade in West African port cities in the 16th and 17th centuries. Centuries later, this postcard inherits and reperforms that discourse. A person supplicates, looking subservient to two feitiço objects, whose proliferations of surface additions and statuesque anthropomorphic forms provide the visual evidence necessary for defining African spiritualities as manufactured, hence the origins of the word fetish, something that is made. Yet in the image's framing, there's a highlighting of the construction of Africanity as a slippage between human and object. The placement of the word feitiço actually labels more the person than the figures, and so recalls the inheritances of Atlantic racial capitalism, the fetishization of Africans' bodies and lives as laboring object commodities, and blackness's construction as a primordial and even enticingly transgressive escape from the constraints of Western modernity. The postcard's message, however, required its makers to strategically forget, or at least erase, a long history of transcultural exchange and competition between the Kingdom of Congo and the Kingdom of Portugal. 4 centuries of treaties, material trading, human trafficking, and cultural exchange between two polities in which the Minkisi figures on the screen materialize and interrogate that history. Stated more broadly, while the term fetish ostensibly references the worldviews of Africans, its dominant historiography has often depended on an absence of Africans' voices. Nobody is asking the person in the photo their thoughts on this word. Right? Indeed, in 1987, historian William Peets noted that his foundational 3-part genealogical history of the fetish, a critical series of 3 articles, which outline the concept's evolution from West Africa, religious fetishism, to Marx, commodity fetishism, to Freud, sexual fetishism, was, quote, not concerned with the relation of the fetish idea to actual conceptions of West African culture, a point which reified a kind of intellectual European and African dialectic, which today I want to work through. In turn, as historian Jennifer Morgan argues, in the 17th and 18th century, writings on the fetish, persons we might today label African emerge not as ethnographically located subjects, but rather function as boundary markers for Western rationalism. Instead, 18th century debates and definitions about the use of this term, fetish, teleologically exclude the opinions of those persons for whom the emergence of the concept of the fetish and its intricate relation to Atlantic slavery, racial capitalism, and European colonization profoundly impacted the trajectory of their lives. This is why I think this trial is so important. They contain testimony from 2 of the millions of African-born persons swept up in the Atlantic slave trade and show how they responded to accusations of fetishism. That testimony occurred in the context of the Portuguese Inquisition, a quasi-governmental body charged with adjudicating crimes against the Catholic Church from throughout Portugal's far-flung maritime empire in the early 18th century. The inquisitorial tribunal in Lisbon held jurisdiction over Portugal's territories in Brazil and in Africa, in addition to receiving cases from metropolitan Portugal, primarily in Lisbon. In the first half of the 18th century, the Inquisition in Lisbon charged no less than 60 people of African descent with feitiçaria, which in the early 18th century not only referred to the use of fetishes, as I've outlined so far, but also indicated a kind of esoteric expertise that remained elusive and feared. Importantly, Inquisition accusations of feitiçaria often emerged from the defendants' efforts to sell their knowledge for monetary gain. Indeed, José Francisco was charged with making and selling fetish objects to those who needed them. And this aspect of the accusation challenged hegemonic conceptions of the Catholic sacred as disconnected from personal and material gain. Fittingly, the Inquisition's accusation of fechisaria emerged from Pereira and Pedroso's supposed production and dissemination of what are called bolsas de mandinga, or mandinga pouches. In the first half of the 18th century, this term referred to a wide range of talismanic amulets and other objects imbued with protective powers and purveyed across the Black Atlantic world. Only a handful of these survive from the 18th century, including the amulet shown on the screen. Sewn into the binding of a 1704 Inquisition record, one can glimpse its internal contents of paper, stones, cotton, and hair through a small tear in its side. But the seeming insignificance of these contents belies the spectacular powers of stopping knives and bullets provided to the person who carried it. Powers enacted when this amulet's maker brought together its radically heterogeneous internal contents. Disavowing any association of cultural origin or hierarchy, these contents embodied their makers' and their users' personal archive of the Black Atlantic world's circuits of exchange and dispossession in the formation of racial capitalism. This amulet, used by an African-born man named Jacques Viegas in Lisbon, and in turn the cause of his confession to the Inquisition in 1704, is the animating object in my recent book, Insignificant Things, Amulets and the Art of Survival in the Early Black Atlantic. In the book, I argue that the visual banality of mandinga pouches, combined with their occluded and diverse intermixture of animating materials, was designed to avoid visual inspection and confound the Inquisition's efforts to describe them. Building on the book's argument, in what follows, I argue that by engaging the ideas of Africans in the Black Atlantic world, we may force a productive remapping of fetishism's entanglement with art history's early development in 18th century Europe. On one level, mandinga pouches suggest that the intensification of Atlantic slavery in the 17th and 18th centuries, alongside what is often characterized as its concomitant disciplining of Africans' bodies as objects, laid down the frameworks of object centrality and racialization required for the later creation of African art history in European academies. This is not to create a facile equivalence between the Inquisition and the later institutionalization of art history in colonial metropoles, but it is to point out that for well over a century, the Inquisition in Lisbon had a well-displayed interest in apprehending, classifying, and describing material objects, that they did this in tandem with efforts to racially classify the accused alongside the objects they made, and that the accused carefully interpreted and responded to those developments. As we'll see, one way that José Francisco Pereira and José Francisco Pedroso responded to the accusation of fetishism was by objecting, and there's a pun there, was by objecting to the terms and the racializing frameworks deployed by their accusers. Pereira and Pedroso did not, per my talk's title today, rename the fetish to correct the mislabelings or misunderstandings of their interrogators, but rather they wanted to interrogate inquisitorial conceptions of these objects' cultural genealogies and valuations. Reading their testimonies against the grain, we began to see how they wrestled with, reframed, and grappled with the implication of the discourse of fetishism in relation to their own lives. Following art historian Delinda Collier, if we are to understand art history's early formation as a pidgin language in the theater of conquest, we should foreground how Africans' 18th century migrations and intellectual worlds were as critical to the discourse of fetishism as they were to their own personal and communal survival. What might Pereira and Pedroso have been saying to their interrogators by renaming the fetish this way? And given that these debates took place in Portugal, how might their contributions impact our historical framing, not only of African art history's institutional origin, but its concomitant racializing mechanisms? Per his own testimony, José Francisco Pereira was born somewhere in West Africa around 1704, where his early life saw increasing hostilities between states like Alada and Weda, Ashanti and Akwamu, as they fought for control of lucrative Atlantic port cities. Brazilian merchants, eager to expand the labor force for gold mining and sugar cultivation across the Atlantic, dominated the purchase of captives enslaved between 1700 and 1730 in this region. Caught up in these conflicts sometime around 1713, aged about 9 or 10, Pereira was enslaved and sold out of Huida in the present-day Republic of Benin and trafficked to Pernambuco in northeastern Brazil. After 9 or 10 years there, he was sent to Minas Gerais, a mountainous mining region in south-central Brazil where he labored for 3 years. After this, he found himself in Rio for another year before traveling with his enslaver to Lisbon late in 1728, around Christmas, he said. The testimonies against him assert that once in Portugal, Pereira entered into a business partnership with José Francisco Pedroso, manufacturing Mandinga amulets. 8 years Pereira's junior, Pedroso was enslaved to Pereira's enslaver's brother, but decades before had also been trafficked through Huida, a connection which raises the possibility that they knew each other in Brazil or even in Africa. The precise circumstances of their arrest are recorded in Pedroso's trial. A Portuguese reverend testified that on July 6, 1730, he heard Pereira and Pedroso standing outside the Church of the Friars of St. Paul, a major church in downtown Lisbon, located less than a block away from where Pereira lived. The reverend stated that he heard Pereira and Pedroso discussing their placement of some objects underneath the church's altar. The inquisitorial scribe, who is writing here in the third person, recorded the reverend's testimony as to what happened after he entered the church to investigate. Quote, "And underneath the altar stone, the witness found 4 sheets of paper with characters, which he brings and offers in this courtroom, and a silver coin tucked between those same papers. Those papers, 2 of which are shown on the screen, were then entered into evidence and materially attached to Pedroso's Inquisition trial record, where they remain to this day. These papers formed the evidentiary basis of the proceedings against Pereira and Pedroso, whose trials hinged on a debate over these objects and their presumed role as inclusions in the amulets that they were accused of making and selling to other Africans in Lisbon. Inquisitors all but ignored their designs, but a brief analysis illuminates Pereira's strategic aesthetics created in the goal of personal and communal protection. On one paper, the one on your left, Pereira draws an inventory of Catholic amulets. The circle design at center reproduces a devotional medal, while the heart shape at top, here's a detail, mirrors the Sacred Heart of Jesus, a popular Catholic motif that often appeared on amulets carried by people of all backgrounds in Brazil, Portugal, and Angola. The heart is surrounded by renderings of Catholic scapulars, a fabric object worn over the shoulders and inscribed with prayers to or images of a saint. And indeed, its text here evokes Gabriel, Jesus, and God. The other paper, on your right, displays lines of ink and dried blood brought together in a version of the Arma Christi, a representation of the instruments of Christ's Passion, commonly rendered on Iberian Catholic medals, papers, processions, and church decorations in the early 18th century, and that Pereira would have likely seen throughout his life in Brazil and in Portugal. The Arma Christi, meanwhile, is flanked by the coat of arms of the Portuguese Empire, a ubiquitous symbol inscribed on, among other locales, Brazilian churches, Portuguese buildings, and probably the ship that transported Pereira across the Atlantic world. Collectively, these designs convey Pereira's belief in and efforts to utilize a wide range of amuletic and protective designs that he saw on the bodies, performances, and religious institutions of Catholicism's diverse manifestations across the Black Atlantic world, particularly in Portugal. Inquisitors' assertions of the status of these papers then as feitiços, or as mandingas, depended less on a close engagement with their design than on an understanding of Pereira's blackness and enslaved status as mediating the lines between fetish and holy object. Right? For the first 3 days of his trial, Pereira repeatedly described the contents and constructions of his amulets. These, he claimed, consisted only of written Catholic orations wrapped around a silver coin. Those ingredients paralleled those the Reverend found when he and Pedroso were arrested, and to that point could still be defended as permissible inclusions in his trial. But after another night in the inquisitorial jails, Pereira returned to the trial on July 11th and expanded on the previous day's recipe. He testified that, in constructing a bolsa de mandinga, quote, In the said paper, all you had to do was put flint, sulfur, gunpowder, a lead bullet, tiger's eye, and abutua, and the blood from the left arm of the person who would keep the pouch, and also he had to take a silver coin and the bone of a dead person. My book contains an entire chapter dedicated to analyzing the paper designs and contents of Pereira's amulets in the context of his experience with Atlantic slavery and religious conversion. To provide a quick summary of some of this argument, consider that contemporary amulets used in West Africa often incorporate material references to that which they seek to protect the user from. The striking inclusion here of flint, gunpowder, and a lead bullet was clearly intended to provide specific protection from ballistic weapons. In the book, I contextualize this near literal menjinga as firearm through Pereira's enslavement in Ouida. Alongside alcohol and tobacco, gunpowder was a crucial commodity during the 18th century slave trade around Ouida, as Brazilian merchants and enslavers sold large quantities of guns and gunpowder alongside Brazilian mined gold. By the 1690s, just 2 decades before José Francisco was enslaved, traders in Ouida imported more than 1,000 firearms annually in a scale that one historian calls, quote, almost insatiable. One may speculate on the extent to which gunpowder not only partially facilitated the conflicts that resulted in José Francisco's enslavement, but whether it was one of the commodities for which his life was exchanged in Ouida. This 1730 engraving of the European port at Savi, which is the main trading depot of the Kingdom of Ouida further inland, speaks to this potential. The view peers over the walls into an idyllic depiction of French, British, and Dutch posts, some attended by European traders in elite dress. Outside, at bottom, a French slave trader arrives with a military escort carried on a palanquin. His entrance into Savi is signaled by a group of Africans holding rifles, firing them amongst other soldiers holding long spears, the 2 kinds of weaponry that predominated in Ouida's military at this time. Less obvious to inquisitors, but possessed of an equal potency to the firearm shown here, was José Francisco's stated inclusion of the material called abutua in his amulets. Likely an ingredient learned from his time in Brazil, abutua is the indigenous Tupi name for a flowering plant whose leaves and roots were commonly used in colonial Brazil and Angola for healing and harming properties, and one species holds the critical ingredient for poison arrow darts. The menjinga amulets José Francisco described at his trial thus assemble a diverse protective arsenal, one that understands the mutual imbrications of interpersonal violence, ritual authority, and his own commodification. But in the book, I also argue that menjinga amulets are most productively understood not as material objects, but as an evolving Black Atlantic discourse of protection, racial subjectivity, and commodity exchange. And so I want to use the rest of my time tonight to delve into a point that emerges directly from the book's argument about menjingas as discourses, not material objects. Because despite the centrality of Pereira's description to almost all current scholarly analysis of menjinga pouches, including the one I just provided you, there is no evidence that his amulets actually existed. What happens then if we consider Pereira's menjinga amulets not as a material reality, but as a conceptual fabrication that emerges slowly through the competing intellectual discourses at his trial? Of the contents Pereira outlined in his testimony, only these papers survive. And in turn, recall that Pereira's description of the amulets changed significantly between the time of his arrest on July 6th and the time of his confession only 5 days later, on July 11th. We'll never know if his elucidation of additional materials that day was a confession designed to elicit mercy, a nod to inquisitors' insatiable curiosity for evidence of diabolical action, or both. I frame Pereira's response to inquisitors as a conversational shadow, where fetishism's discursive presence requires the production of blackness as a conceptual antitype of those who Pereira's inquisitorial accusers wished themselves to be. Pereira performs his blackness, performs his otherness here in recognition and understanding of the way Black things and Black people mediate key social relations and political hierarchies in the wider Black Atlantic world. Following historian and religion scholar J. Laurent Mattori, what we see in Pereira's trial, and what I'm going to explore in the rest of the evening, is an attempt to demonize blackness at the exact moment it is framed as an escapist and even exciting fantasy for inquisitorial titillation. A dialectic that perhaps explains why, in the final days of his trial in 1731, Pereira ends up providing extensive and graphically detailed descriptions of his sexual congress with diabolical forces as his interrogators begged for more. By July 11, 1730, Pereira may have realized that the best chance of escaping his trial was to give the Inquisition exactly what they wanted, to first perform his blackness and then figure out ways to challenge the presumptions his accusers brought to it. On the first day of his interrogations, July 6, 1730, neither inquisitors nor Pereira used the word Mandinga. Pereira instead referred to his creations generically as papers or orations, which helped to free him and his clients from physical violence, objects he claimed he learned how to produce while he was enslaved in northeastern Brazil. Inquisitors, meanwhile, seizing on the paper's unnatural effects, began inquiring about their Brazilian origins and referring to them as feitiços. On July 7th, the next day, having just heard Pereira recount his life journey through West Africa and Brazil, inquisitors asked him directly whether or not he heard or knew anyone who made feitiços in these regions. And the inquisitorial scribe recorded that Pereira said, quote, that Pereira said that in Pernambuco, in Brazil, and also in this kingdom of Portugal, he heard that some people showed feitiços, which Pereira defined as things that have a pact with the devil. Pereira is on the defensive here. He repeats his accuser's understanding of the feitiços equation with demonry, which will later allow them to assert Pereira's knowledge of the practice. But the gaps are important in his response. Pereira expresses his familiarity with feitiço as a concept, and yet despite the leading question about its African origins, he situates feitiço not as an African practice, but as a product of colonial and metropolitan life in the Portuguese Empire. And in the second half of his response, Pereira implies that a feitiço is a thing, which manipulates spiritual relations, but he doesn't define what thing means. He provides little information to help his accusers process the feitiço indexically and materially. Pereira's response thus shows how feitiço was not a term applied exclusively to Africans' religiosities. Indeed, an epistemological category like African religion doesn't exist in 1730, but rather described quasi-personal divine powers associated more closely with the materiality of the sacramental object than would be an independent, immaterial, demonic spirit. In the discursive gaps created as Pereira and the inquisitors talk past each other, no one can explain where the feitiço falls in a prevailing dialectic dependent on a dichotomy between object and body or object and spirit. Nothing in Pereira or Pedroso's trials, and I read all of them, suggests that they were familiar with the wide range of 17th and 18th century writings regarding European encounters with African objects. Yet their careful responses to inquisitorial questioning seem well positioned to counter an emergent class of European authors who tried to disentangle African objects from their social worlds, and in so doing found fold such objects into systems of classification, to, in other words, make them into objects to be studied and controlled. Bit of a deviation. Writing from the Gold Coast in present-day Ghana in 1679, French trader Jean Barbeau described a fetish that he had taken from an African resident at a Danish fort. Emphasizing the psychological distress his touching and handling of the fetish caused its caretaker, Barbeau writes dismissively of the insistence that the African man, whom Barbeau does not name, would now need to appease the figure with ritual offerings that included gold and brandy, key trade goods of Atlantic commerce during the era of human trafficking in West Africa. While Barbeau's writings include his drawing of the object shown here, he struggled to identify the fetish's design in relation to its form. Quote, "At one end of the figure was a sort of human face," he writes, before asserting the drawing could substitute for what he acknowledged as his own lack of descriptive precision. Barbeau's uncanny figure struggles to balance the attempted naturalism of the face with what he calls a Bologna sausage body, or what I read as an evocation of Barbeau's anxiety about this figure's upending of a human-object dialectic. Barbeau's visual and linguistic struggle to manifest a dichotomy between an object and a body runs through a series of 18th century images from Africa in which, in the context of asymmetrical trade in Atlantic ports, visually forge a body-object dichotomy with the effect of disassociating black bodies from black things, while also making black lives into commodity objects. Barbeau is explicit on this. Discussing, quote, the fetishes that Africans wear, end quote, he notes that it is, quote, necessary to snatch them forcibly, and even when you order them to hand them over, it is quite difficult to succeed. In Lisbon in 1730, José Francisco Pereira faced an inquisitorial trial based on enacting a protracted and violent removal of his objects from their social and ritual roles, the slow creation of an object-body binary with severe consequences for the lives of those caught in its wake. Two more examples might drive home the point. In this early 17th century engraving by Theodore de Bry, the word feticio, which is another spelling of fechisu, floats unmoored against the bodily gestures, instruments, trees, and objects that make up this vision of life on the Gold Coast, present-day Ghana. By 1732, the objects in the bottom left of the engraving had made their way into a later edition of Jean Barbeau's writings, but now completely devoid of any human relation. The new engraving presents an array of objects which make clear the material embodiment of the fetiso as an object classifiable or sortable, to pun the engraving's title, through practices of visual inspection and scrutiny dependent on their divorce from social networks. And finally, a mid-18th century watercolor by Italian missionary Bernardino d'Asti shows an Italian Capuchin missionary violently casting out the material objects of divination from a house in Congo in Central Africa. As art historian Cécile Formant notes in her discussion of this image, an important goal of missionary activity in Central Africa at this time was finding and destroying problematic objects and replacing them with Catholic devotional paraphernalia. The fleeing figure at right and the concerned, befuddled look of the figures at left may be, as Formant notes, a shock at either the sight of the objects or the prospect of their imminent destruction. But to this I would add a worry over the object's dislocation and disentangling, a sense of revelation and casting out that frames them for the viewer's visual inspection. What I'm suggesting here is that in Lisbon in 1730, Pereira and Pedroso push back against an inquisitorial investment in the very idea of a material object that can be divorced from its social relations and incorporated into a trial record as a kind of evidence, a kind of decontextualized formalism, or an inappropriate commitment to the thing itself as isolated and autonomous. This is intentionally blank. Throughout Pereira and Pedroso's trial records, we see inquisitors implicitly associating the fechisu concept with blackness. At multiple points, the inquisitorial scribe equates the term fechisu with the term menjinga. Menjinga entered the Portuguese lexicon in the early 18th century as the adaptation of an ethnonym associated with the West African kingdom of Mali and its diasporas from the 15th century onward. Originally referring only to people and specific cultural practices, by 1700, the Inquisition began to use menjinga as a shorthand for the sorcerous and foreign objects that came from a vaguely defined elsewhere, while the term's African associations made its racial implications clear. Pereira and Pedroso then, confronted with this classificatory scheme, saw two problems. First, the forced breaking of their networks of protection and survival, in which inquisitorial questioning worked to sever the papers under discussion from their protective roles. And second, inquisitors' equation of the term fechisu with the term menjinga, as an effort to sequester and objectify blackness as a racial and performative category of being. In response, Pereira and Pedroso tried to avoid or reframe the discourse of menjinga altogether. Though on July 7, 1730, it was Pedroso who first introduced the term menjinga into the trial record, he did so to disentangle inquisitors' assertion of the object's association with blackness. On July 7th, Pedroso argued that it was not Lisbon's black communities, but actually white people who referred to the pouches as menjinga. Pedroso said that, quote, that the said black man José, which is referring to José Francisco Pereira, made menjingo pouches, or pouches the blacks call relic, to rid them of stabs and slashes. Thus, while white inquisitors implicitly emphasized the perceived Africanness of the amulets by labeling them manjinga, Pedroso asserted that his network of free and enslaved black people in Portugal called them bolsas de relíquia, or relic pouches. Pedroso was not given space in the trial to elaborate on his use of relic pouch, but its strategy is evident even in the scribe's handwriting. The scribe actually capitalized the word, a gesture this particular scribe typically reserved for references only to holy objects and practices the Inquisition was charged with protecting. Relic is, of course, the term for an object touched by a Catholic saint, or more commonly a part of their body, a bone or blood. Pedroso likely knew that bones and blood, inclusions in the manjinga amulets that inquisitors cited, so remember, Pereira's testimony actually said bones and blood are in the pouches, were common and occasionally singular forms in holy Catholic relics. As such, Pedroso's labeling of bolsas de manjinga as relic pouches flipped inquisitors' accusation on their heads. Recall, too, that Pereira's papers present an easily identifiable and careful reworking of Catholic scapulars, pendants, and orations. By converting these objects into paper and ink, he literally constructed a pouch of relics. Pereira and Pedroso's vision thus materializes the mutual constitution of Black Atlantic religious objects in a realm of cross-cultural translation. And Pedroso's description of relic pouches here asserts that he understood his work's role as part of a world-making and transformation between Africans and Europeans, even in a context of severe cultural asymmetry. But moreover, Pedroso's deployment of the term relic pouch reminded inquisitors of the relations between Blackness and Catholicism in the early modern Luso-Atlantic world. Portuguese laws instructed enslavers to baptize their captives and teach them the basics of Catholic doctrine. But in practice, enslavers were hesitant to do so, since instructing them in Catholicism opened them up to participation in brotherhoods that could provide mutual aid and funding for purchasing their own freedom, cultural connections and community with other Africans, legal opportunities to challenge or complain about their treatment, and feast days on which they need not labor. In this context, Afro-Atlantic Catholics largely operated their own systems of devotion, including black confraternities that chose their patron saints and sacred images that stood on the altars they rented from host churches. By the time of Pereira's trial in 1730, Lisbon had 9 black confraternities, all of which celebrated feast and saint days using lavish royal ceremonies and often claimed inheritance from West African nations. One 18th-century confraternity in Lisbon explicitly linked itself to the black man of the Congo Kingdom, the aforementioned Central African polity, which had employed its own version of Catholicism as a state religion since the late 15th century. And in 1730, another black confraternity affiliated itself with the, quote, Mina nation of West Africa, of which Pereira and Pedroso both claimed descent. They identified themselves as Mina. More concretely, African manjinga makers had been referring to their creations as relics for at least half a century prior to this trial. In 1690, Patricio de Andrade, a freeman from Cape Verde, appeared before the Inquisition on charges of making and selling amulets that he referred to only as relics, godly things, and holy things. Yet unlike Andrade's case, José Francisco Pedroso here specifically cites racial subjectivity as a precondition for the holy terms. He refers to relic being what the blacks call these pouches. And in so doing, he articulates a kind of shared naming convention that allows him to insist on the wider social and religious network in which he operates without abandoning the racial categorization that was the basis of his legal status and his chosen community in diaspora. Pereira, meanwhile, continued to press the definition of manjinga as a kind of fear on the part of enslavers and elites during the interrogations of July 10th. Pereira was fielding a question about his use of touch cards, an apparently common object in colonial Brazil that consisted of pieces of paper with drawings or orations which allowed users to gain sexual submission from desired partners. Pereira claimed that when he arrived in Rio de Janeiro from Minas Gerais, probably in 1726, so he's traveling inside of Brazil, he had been searched at a customs house, and officials there had confiscated the paper orations that he was carrying. Seizing on the point, inquisitors asked Pereira how he could have thought that the papers he made in Lisbon were godly or licit or permissible, given that those of the same type had been confiscated from him in Brazil. And he answered, his master didn't want his slaves using any paper orations for fear that they had them to make menjingas, and because of that fear, they were thrown away. This is the first time Pereira uses the word menjinga, 3 days after Pedroso's deployment of it. And again, Pereira uses menjinga here not to describe something he made, but to describe a fear that white enslavers held about widely used and disseminated protective objects of popular Catholicism once they fell into the hands of enslaved Africans. Critical to the argument, but left unstated in this exchange, is that the so-called touch cards here under discussion were materially indistinguishable from otherwise permissible Catholic orations and prayer cards that were commonly distributed in churches. Though Pereira does not describe the paper he was carrying that day, it is possible that the sole reason for their confiscation, and indeed he says as much, was because he was the one using them. Pereira thus positions the concept of menjinga as a materialized anxiety over blackness's bodily contact with power objects in a slavery society. And so when inquisitors label these works as menjinga, it is first an implicit acknowledgement of the ways that menjinga makers carefully fabricated an egalitarian vision of religious pluralism against a backdrop of racial subjugation. And second, a deliberate misreading of these objects so that inquisitors could, against all evidence, tie them to a nascent conception of blackness as a dangerous lack of perspective and interpretive reason. Intentionally blank again. We could, of course, dismiss Pereira and Pedroso's framing of menjinga as a discursive fear, and their concept of the relic pouch, as inquisitors did, as a simple but necessary defense of their actions at trial. And certainly I'm not arguing that menjinga amulets are just imagined products of inquisitorial witch hunting. But I am asking how histories of these objects, and perhaps the history of the term fetishism more broadly, might change if we took seriously their assertion that the term menjinga was not used by Africans in Lisbon. What might it mean that Pereira and Pedroso challenge menjinga as an epistemic category in tandem with its racial implications at the very moment of its creation? Already in 1730, they're asserting that white elites are far more interested in conceptually framing their works through a dogged pursuit of cultural difference, and in tandem with their intellectual investment in racial essentialism and blackness as irrationalism as a precondition of that difference. And so the assembling of Bolsas de Menjinga in my lecture title tonight refers not just to the performative processes by which Pereira brought those objects into being, but it also refers to how we can't disentangle that historical process from our own efforts to rematerialize it. As Haitian historian and theorist Michel Rolfe-Trouillot wrote in 1995, any historical narrative is a particular bundle of silences. For Trouillot, the seeming boundedness of historical formations belies their fissures and their fabrications. And as if manifesting Trouillot's point, Pereira's Bolsas de Menjinga slowly emerged through a highly asymmetrical discourse over the course of his trial, a ritual and procedural bundling of the kind of object and racializing schema that inquisitors needed to justify their concluding words, quote, that the Menjinga is most horrible and abominable, and it is of such an ugly name and practiced among black men with such superstitious, vain, and improper ceremonies. The material objectification of Pereira's amulets here masquerades its own sublimation in inquisitorial procedure. And so it's not a coincidence that this kind of objectification rested at the same time on the racializing objectification of human beings. Stated another way, the concept of the fetish and the concept of menjinga emerge in tandem with the fetishization of human lives as objects in a wider Atlantic nexus. What made Europeans different in this exchange, to quote art historian Dylan de Collier, of inter-party mediations of value vis-a-vis the fetish, is that they would go on to graft their negative experience of difference onto a racial schema within a complex trade relationship that included the fabrication of capital via the body of the slave. The visibility of the term fetish within our texts, then, should have the express purpose of desublimating the vicissitudes of medium and the racializing mechanism of art history. But even in that context, Pereira and Pedroso fabricated objects which demonstrated the mutually constituted visions Africans and Europeans brought to the formation of early modern religious material culture. I can only hope that José Francisco Pereira and José Francisco Pedroso chose their words thinking that someone someday would reread them with a more generous perspective than that which they were given in Lisbon in 1730, and probably a more generous perspective than they deserved. But as I've been asked to speak on this department's centennial, a time that demands reflection on the discipline of art history and its possibilities for the next century, I'm left with a question that Pereira and Pedroso, I think, ask implicitly. Do art historians describe art, or do our descriptions produce what we study? As art historian Thomas J. Lax notes, as if anticipating my argument this evening, a recognition of just how the task of description itself is a mode of production might better name our entanglements with the logics of colonialism. As Pereira and Pedroso understood and articulated, the act of describing an object is inseparable from, and even a precondition of, the production of analytical categories which emerged through the violence of the colonial encounter that made its description possible. The slave, the individual, the artwork, the commodity form. All of those analytics are not only settler colonialism's leftovers, but they sustain and naturalize its claim to occupation in the present. And against that backdrop, Pereira and Pedroso's renaming of the fetish in the context of their trial is not just a defense mechanism, nor is it an effort to enforce a kind of cultural distinction, but rather it is a matter of epistemological and methodological precision, which they knew had consequences not just for their own lives, but for the millions who came after them. Thank you.
So we're going to take questions because of the giant room, passing around a microphone, and it's, my pleasure to facilitate that. Thank you so much, Matt.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Matt. That was wonderful. Now I have to read your book, which you said has a whole chapter on these images.
Yes,
and
chapter 2. Yeah.
Yes, and I'm just so struck by them visually and have lots of questions, but they're very simple questions, really. Iconographically on the right, you said those are things to do with the crucifixion, but there's also a little person by the heraldic shield on the left. Can you say a little bit more about what you think that represents? It's really, really fascinating.
My dream is to find the exact version of the Portuguese coat of arms in Lisbon that he's using as visual inspiration for this, or if there is one, right? I haven't found it yet. I have a hunch that that's supposed to be a depiction of the Roman soldier who stabbed Jesus in the side during his crucifixion.
Of course, okay,
Right? So he's holding up, right, what looks like a kind of spear. And there's other drawings, which actually I didn't bring tonight, which create a visual analogy between a spear and a quill that he's actually using to create the designs. I don't have that one in this PowerPoint, I'm sorry. So I'm pretty sure that's what it's supposed to be. So it's striking in that circumstance to me that he's not including a depiction of Jesus, right? So it's not a crucifix, it's just a cross. So there's a real emphasis here on that who is sort of perpetuating the violence as opposed to the figure who's receiving it, right? The other thing to note is that both the crest of the Portuguese Empire and that soldier and what appears to be a breaking wheel on top left are all drawn in the blood of José Francisco's left arm. At least that's what he attests at his trial, and the rest of it is ink. And I dedicate some time in that particular chapter to thinking about why he might have chosen these different materials for these different aspects. Yeah.
Okay, I'll have to read it. Thank you.
Sure, yeah.
Thanks, Jill.
Oh, Tom, I'm coming down with the mic.
Thank you. This was a wonderful talk, and like Nancy, I'm sort of caught up by the iconographic details, because one of the images you showed us, I mean, to me, looked like a Shivalinga, and that was being reclassified as something African. So not only are the inquisitors or the European interlocutors curiously recasting Catholic objects, legitimate Catholic objects, as fetishes, racializing them because of the people who are using them and purportedly selling them. They're also misrepresenting even the identity of the ethnic identity of the particular objects here in question. So I'm just curious as to, I'm actually working on a related topic of race and also enslavement involved in medieval Venice. And I'm struck by the fact that the so-called fetishes in the manuscript are so authentic that and part of what I've been studying is how, already back in the 12th and 13th century, there was the requirement that the enslaved person be renamed as well. They were baptized, they were renamed, and in the documents I've been just looking at this summer, they give the name. In this case, they were Tatars. They were given their original name, and then they give the baptized name. And it implies that then there is this process of conversion, and you alluded to that, and therefore that they, on the basis of these drawings, had a very good knowledge, a strong knowledge of Catholic culture, and including using this terminology of relics. To me, this is fascinating that then that would be absolutely turned on its head, even though the evidence is so clear that they were following Catholic practice and Catholic imagery. The only thing I thought was strange in the other image, the ones in the inquisitorial trial, Inquisition, is the inscription itself around the central image on the left-hand page of the Arma Christi again. It looks like this is actually rendered as a kind of medallion.
Yes.
As a physical sort of metal amulet. And I mean, this tradition, including inscriptions, some of which seem to be garbled. This looks as if it has, in some cases, they're Greek characters, in some cases they're Latin, but I'm just wondering whether that's also, I mean, it's evoking a very long-standing Christian genre. It goes back in, I can think of examples in Egyptian Christianity back into the 6th century. I'm sorry, this is not a very coherent question. It's really more of a response.
I've been taking notes in my head as you've been talking.
That this is really a kind of very long-standing and old tradition within Christianity and even within Africa itself. I can give examples of that going back at least to the 6th century. The spells, the amuletic imagery combined with what would be deemed to be legitimate Catholic images. But to me, I'm just struck by how do they justify this reclassification? I mean, you're saying it's the racialization, that they are recasting what would normally be understood as legitimate Catholic images.
Okay, there's 3 different questions in there. I'm going to try to answer them all. So first off with this, it does bear a resemblance to a Shivalinga, very much hear that, but this is probably a representation of a Vodun, or possibly Eshu Elegba. This is Ghana, so it's a bit further west than that, who is typically in a ceramic vessel and receives offerings inside of that. So a small, sort of slightly abstracted figurative sculpture that's the center of community ritualizing, right, is probably what's being referenced here. Barbeau's interesting inability to process that complexity, right, is really what is coming through here. Meanwhile, getting back to these, so you noted that the circle in the middle bears a resemblance to a medallion. I think intentionally so. So the coin that they claim was stolen from the altar on July 6, 1730. Portuguese coins like that, small silver coins, were commonly repurposed as medallions. and worn as amulets in context with scapulars and the other medallions that you see represented here. And I think that would have potentially carried extra resonance for José Francisco Pereira, given that silver mined in the Americas used to produce those coins was probably one of the commodities for which his life was traded in West Africa. So I went on a series of numismatic websites and found a coin that was produced from that time period under that king with a hole through it that was used as a medallion, and I bought it just so I could reproduce it in the book. Meanwhile, the inscriptions that you're talking through, right, his mixture of Latin and Greek letters, and you're saying the script is somewhat illegible, and so chapter 3 in the book goes into his use of text and language. I think there's a way, he testified at his trial that he's illiterate, that he doesn't know how to read and write. But I think he is strategically playing with syntax, with structure, with directionality here in a way that plays against what is a rigid sort of formulaic structure of what you see in the actual Inquisition trial itself. You were also talking about naming and conversion and renaming, right? So you'll notice that their names in the trial are José Francisco Pereira and José Francisco Pedroso. These are two Portuguese names. And one of the answers that and they would have been well instructed in Catholic doctrine, presumably, right? He would have had plenty of experience with popular Catholicism in the context of Brazil and Portugal. One way to think about that is that Inquisition trials are commonly cited by historians working on my period to understand how Africans related to Catholicism, but they are a highly biased source. We're talking about millions of enslaved Africans in Brazil at this moment, and we have a total of 60 trials from the Inquisition, right? So we tend to overestimate the extent of the power that the Inquisition had in people's daily lives, right? It was probably a very diverse and widely understood practice. But as we circle back, you asked the question about their names. There's an amazing moment in José Francisco Pereira's trial. There's a genealogy section in the trial, and this is where he sort of talks about his background, he talks about his parentage, and he establishes that he's a good Catholic. And the trial reads, the accused is asked the name of his parents. And the accused responds that he does not know the name of his parents in the Portuguese language. And so clearly what happened is he was asked the name of his parents. He said what that was in Yoruba, in Fon, or Ga, right, whatever language it was he was speaking. It doesn't have a Portuguese translation. They asked him again, and then it says it's not written in the Portuguese language. So reading the trials for those gaps and how they reflect the process of conversion is something that I try to delve into a little deeper in the book. Yeah. Yes, hi.
Thanks so much for your talk. I'm glad I used your book chapter to teach research method at a summer program in Cambodia.
I'm still stunned by that. Yes. Thank you so much.
I'm working on the Buddhist magical monks and dealing with all these kind of amulets, somewhat similar. Mm-hmm. I was struck by Shiralingam as well because I'm curious about the background of the person who sketched that image, Jean Bakbo, right?
Oh, Jean Bakbo, yeah.
Right? Who is he? So I'm just curious because this is in 17th century?
Yeah, 1679.
Yeah. So what reminds me about this is because in the 18th century, there's a Catholic priest visiting in the 18th century Ayutthaya, the former capital city of Siam or Thailand, Simon de la Loubert. Mm. He's a Catholic priest, and he described in his travelogue the Buddhist stupa as pyramid.
Sure.
So what I guess is that, we can't totally disregard the how he might associate this image with Shiralingam because Réunion is also French colony in Africa, right? So what I guess is there's a possibility that the colonial intertextual interpretation might occur in this process. Mm-hmm. Yes,
that's an interesting point. Okay, that's an interesting point. I don't know if he ever traveled to South Asia or if he traveled at least to the Indian Ocean coast, right? Which would add more fodder to the argument you're making. That said, it's a century later, and I'll have to go back. I mean, he's French. He works for the French West Africa Company. He's moving back and forth between what is now Benin and Ghana and France for for about 10 years in this latter part of the 17th century. But it's something there that would add fodder to your argument. There's an Italian-born artist and cartographer who's working for the Portuguese army in the late 1800s, who travels both to Brazil and to India. And he makes a kind of visual dictionary of Hindu spirits. And he uses, his name is Carlo Julião, he's a fascinating person. And he uses basically the iconography of those spirits to inflect the way that he's drawing kind of Afro-Brazilian religious life around the same time. He also makes a dictionary of trees. He's an interesting person. So those kind of intertextual relationships that you're articulating are happening later. So I'll think about that more. Yeah, I was too dismissive earlier. I apologize for that.
Yeah, thanks for that great talk. So this might be another question that would answer itself if I read your book, which I intend to do soon, hopefully. But I was kind of interested in drawing out what you were saying about the formation of art history and how it relates to this, which I think was a little compressed because you had a lot to talk about. But I mean, it's kind of striking that you're talking about this. It's sort of like doing art history without doing art history or something in this specific case where there's a discursive construction of the fetish that very noticeably and maybe pointedly does not describe anything visually or formally, right? So I'm curious how that relates to the point you were making. Another point, I think maybe kind of intentionally provocatively throwing out the term, decontextualized formalism, right? And it might have something to do with kind of visual versus verbal representations or discourses in terms of the idea of what a fetish is and what it looks like. And it's a bit of an open-ended question, so maybe if you could just kind of like say what you say and
and see where it goes. Yeah. So what's a better example? So if we go back to maybe a different trial, and this is one I talk a little bit more about in the book, is Jacques Villegas's trial. So part of the opening section of Jacques Villegas's trial and of many Mandinga makers is actually what we would recognize now as like an extended ekphrastic visual description of the contents of these amulets. That the amulets are received by the Inquisition trial. There's a dramatic moment when someone takes a penknife, opens the side, spills out the contents, and organizes a description of the internal contents that actually starts with what they think is most objectionable to least objectionable. It always goes in that order. So the things that they note first are the bones and the hair and all these other things, and then they trail off, and eventually they get to, let's say, papers or orations. And the title of the book comes from the tail end of one of these descriptions, which is, and other fragments of insignificant things. And so what I want to press on in the book is precisely that effort to create what's almost a visual kind of ekphrasis, or this kind of intense description around the object, and then the intellectual struggle to relate that to a kind of conceptualization of its difference, bound up, I think, both teleologically and racially. So one of the other points that I get to, and that Tom mentioned, was that most of the contents of these amulets are actually materially indistinguishable from amulets that had been circulating in Catholic Europe for quite some time. It's just suddenly now in 1700, as more and more Africans start to use them, they become symptomatic of African religiosities, right? So there's a simultaneous bifurcation where you have this kind of decontextualized formalism. They're precisely not asking, where did you learn this? What are they for, right? What effect do they have on your daily life? There's none of that, with an effort to project a kind of cultural understanding onto it that's defining, right? And so both of those poles, I'm sort of provocatively suggesting, become preconditions for the later institutionalization of art history, without saying, as you said, they're sort of practicing a proto-art history without doing it. Right? That's my shoot from the hip answer. That work? Yeah.
I'm going to bring it down just 1 second. Jennifer had also.
Oh, yes.
Thank you so much for this really wonderful and rich talk. I have, I think, kind of a basic question, actually, being very unfamiliar with this this material, which is simply who is it solely Africans that are using these amulets? I mean, this seems like the kind of thing that a lot of white people would also like to get their hands on, and I'm wondering if that's the cause for any of this anxiety, is the kind of slippage of Catholicism and proper white behavior with African religion.
Yes. Yeah.
I figured, but can you give us an example or an anecdote, or like what's happening at this moment, just in terms of is there increased examples of this kind of filtering into Portuguese society?
Yeah. So most of the people charged by the Inquisition with feitiçaria are not African, right? So there are many more Inquisition trials, right, charged with feitiçaria than there are Africans. But it seems that Africans are the one who are most disproportionately focused on when it comes to using objects called menjinga, right? That said, it does appear to be a quite wide-ranging practice. So Pereira and Pedroso both talk about how they're selling amulets to white people, to free Africans, to free Creoles, which are people of African descent but who were born in Brazil. So it's a widely diversified practice. And so part of the effort to sort of make it into an African practice seems precisely to be a response when its clientele is diversifying quite widely, right? And I should note here kind of the institutional framework that takes on. It's very common in Brazil for enslavers to be enslaving Africans who are well-versed in healing traditions, and actually in African healing traditions, and actually hire them out and accrue money for their services. So I haven't confirmed it yet, but I am positive that there are people in Brazil who are enslaving Africans who are making menjingas, and they're actually making profit, right, from the menjingas that they're selling. So very, very much. Yeah. Dr. Sullivan.
Thank you so much. I, of course, have many detailed questions that I will
Sure.
save for later. I have one that picks up on Daniel's question. You opened up, I wrote it down to make sure I remembered. You opened up your talk by kind of talking about this is a defining moment in the creation of what we call African art history as one label. And you end up by talking about like art history generally. And I'm really curious about your thoughts on what we do as quote-unquote Africanist art historians, and how we study African objects as art, and how does that fit into your thoughts about objectification and exoticization? And I'm thinking especially about how the generation of scholars before us will frequently talk about what they did as fighting to have African art considered art and have a home within art history. But like, what do we make of that now as we are kind of like deconstructing that idea? So would love to hear your thoughts.
This will be a long talk over appetizers at dinner. Okay. Arnold Rubin in 1975 came up with this concept of a power object, right? And part of the point in him articulating this term was, and most of the objects he's writing about as power objects, right, are objects like this, right? So there's an effort simultaneously in that construction to, as he says, not describe African objects using a term like fetish, using a term like primitive, to construct a term that seems more appropriate to a wider cultural discourse, which is distinctly African but also widely applicable. But at the same time, part of the focus on Nkisi figures is because they're sculptural, because they're anthropomorphic, because they fold into sort of wider and long accepted categories of what counts as sculptural and sort of worthy of study in an academy. So there's that double move. And I press against Rubin quickly in the book, while also noting that like I'm standing on his shoulders, right? I can't make the arguments I'm making without him doing that first. And I move quickly to say like, well, we're kind of substituting one term for another here, right? So we're using power object when really we mean fetish, and we use it to mean the same thing, first. And secondly, I think what what happened as, I'm going to speak in really broad strokes, and you're going to object to me later, and that's going to be great at dinner. But as African art history starts to become institutionalized in art history departments, and as it's coming out of, the Peace Corps and some of the early people teaching African art history are anthropologists, there is this effort to create distinctly African categories which are used as explanatory frameworks to define the material objects that we're studying. And part of what I'm trying to push against here, and part of what we need to interrogate, is exactly that kind of cultural differentiation ignores some of the ways that the first people who get classified as African, the first people who kind of live with the, not the burden is not what I want to say, but who are understanding the implications of that term for their own lives, are having to push against the idea that there is something culturally distinct about them, right? That they're sort of operating outside of the confines of a European modernity, right? Big strokes, right? And sort of erasing a lot of subtleties here. And so I want to nudge that. I want to push that and ask why not just the one tribe, one style model, right? And we can talk about that too, but why efforts to kind of distinctify African perspectives, right? What role those play inside of larger art historical discourses. So in that sense, I don't think the development of African art history is that sort of disentangleable from the development of art history broadly as a discipline, right? I think there's a reason that the rise of broad art historical academies occurs in the early 19th century at the height of the transatlantic slave trade. I don't think that's a coincidence, right? I want somebody to write that book. I don't think I'm the person to do it, but anyway, that's my provocative answer to your question. Yeah.
Thanks so much. I guess my question is in a similar vein of, you've talked a lot about the institutionalization of art history, and I was thinking, I'm curious your thoughts about the institutionalization of religious studies as a discipline, since these are religious objects, and also the hierarchy of objects that exists in both, in some ways, religious studies and art history, and that these are objects of popular devotion, and they're ephemeral, and they're often used or associated with in scholarship by people who are marginalized, whether that's women or sort of the uneducated, sort of this magical, amuletic kind of devotional object, and how that plays into conversations about these objects.
I feel like you're more qualified to answer that question than I am, probably. The institutionalization of religious studies, I'm going to be honest, maybe this is showing I actually don't know much about the sort of rise of religious studies as an institution in academies and sort of how that intersects with this. I'm moving away from the postcard because I don't like it very much. I can talk more about the sort of primary role that I would say foci on religion and spirituality have been sort of paradigmatic and even foundational in African diaspora studies. So the sort of birth of African diaspora studies, especially in the South Atlantic world in the first half of the 20th century, is coming out of scholars who are moving back and forth between West Africa and Brazil and thinking about African cultural retentions, right, in the context of religion and spirituality and religious movements. So in that sense, one of the things that the book is trying to do is actually to build on and kind of slightly interrogate that history in terms of what was being focused on and what was sort of occupying the attention of those scholars and what was moving against it. But the other thing you're pressing on here is, I don't know that I would be confident talking about if religious studies is merging out, like we're separating different religious structures and sort of talking about them as sort of long-term paradigmatic. Yeah, let's talk more later. I don't know, I'm still thinking through that, right? That's a terrible answer to your question, but yeah.
Well, I want to thank you so much for your generosity. We've really put you through it. I think I could maybe take one last very brief question, if someone is...
Yes, I'll keep it brief. Thank you, Matt.
Sure.
And perhaps we can chat more later. I'm curious, you said,
Good to see you also.
Great, yeah, great to see you. in terms of what these cultures share and the distinctions that should be blurred between them that you were just discussing a minute ago, I'm curious about inquisitions. And I don't know much about this literature, but in various West African cases, a huge part of religious practice is to find out who's using the religion against you in a certain kind of ways, to find out who's bewitching you, whatever it might be. So it seems to me that there's this parallel going on in this other religious practice, and that people practicing on both sides of, who've been experiencing both things would find those parallels, would see those parallels quite clearly, and would construct these things in that sense. So is there scholarship on, or what can you say about inquisitions, both in Europe and in African, religious practices?
Oh, okay. It does.
Or however you might want to respond.
Yeah. Jill asked for a short question. That is not a short question. Really quickly, I can give one example. So there's a high probability that the person who made this amulet, as well as José Francisco Pereira, they were probably making these amulets in West Africa, and they were using them precisely as a response to the Kingdom of Dahome's appropriation of specific spirits that were being used against the very people they were enslaving, right? So one of the Kingdom of Dahome's conquest strategies in the 1720s and 1730s is to appropriate the spirits and rehouse the spirits of all of the people that they had conquered. Suzanne Blier writes really, really strikingly about this. And those moves are maybe countered by other classes of objects, especially sort of amuletic pouches like this, which are fighting against those efforts of the Kingdom of Dahomey to claim those spirits and then use them, right, against the very people who had them before. So I think so part of the point I'm trying to make in the book is that by the time these two leave West Africa, even at age 9 or 10, they have a deep understanding, right, of what they're going to recognize later as inquisitorial procedure, as a kind of sort of nascent surveillance, and of the reappropriation strategically of objects and spiritualities to protect them and sort of fight against someone else. That said, most of the objects that sort of pop up in the Inquisition trials are made by men and are used to protect themselves from violence. So there's very little mention in the Inquisition trials of ones that are sort of aggressive. They're always defense mechanisms, and I sort of write about why I think that is in the book. There's also very few women who pop up, and I have reasons I think that that's happening too. But yeah, we can chat about this more too. Yeah.
A wonderful way to end on. We all need to read and reread the book. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming out on this cold evening, and Matt, for your generosity with us. Thank you.